get into the boat and go on ahead to the other side while he dismissed the crowds. After he had dismissed the crowds, he went up the mountain by himself to pray. When evening came, he was there alone, but by this time, the boat, battered by the waves, was far from the land, for the wind was against them. And early in the morning he came walking towards them on the sea. But when the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were terrified, saying, "It's a ghost." And they cried out in fear. But immediately Jesus spoke to them and said, "Take heart, it is I, do not be afraid." Peter answered him, "Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water." He said, "Come." So Peter got out of the boat, started walking on the water, and came towards Jesus. But when he noticed the strong wind, he became frightened, and beginning to sink, he cried out, "Lord, save me." Jesus immediately reached out his hand and caught him, saying to him, "You of little faith, why did you doubt?" When they got into the boat, the wind ceased, and those in the boat worshipped him, saying, "Truly, you are the Son of God."
Thanks, Abby. Also, fun fact, I didn't even tell the youth what I was preaching about or what the passage would be. I just asked, what are some songs that y'all might like to sing? And Josie suggested this song by the Lakeshore, and I just thought that was really cool how the water theme got to play in there a little bit. So great pick, Josie. I also didn't even know that song, so it was really cool to learn a new song this week. In addition to that, I also want to say just a huge thank you to the incredible leadership of the young people here in the front and our amazing ushers there in the back. I really appreciate you all stepping up and being willing to participate in worship in this way. I'm so grateful to be just surrounded by such strong leaders in this community. I'm also grateful to be here with the larger Hopewell Presbyterian community as well, both in person and on Zoom. Just thankful for the last couple months and particularly for today, this opportunity to be in the pulpit. I bet for a lot of us, as Abby was reading this passage, memories of storms came to mind. Or if not then, maybe they are now as I am saying it. Maybe even the most recent storm we had last weekend. I don't know where all of you were last weekend when that hit, but Lindsay and I were actually driving back from some friend's house at Princeton Junction, and we had to change routes a couple times and even drive on the sidewalk to avoid all the fallen branches. And I was driving so slow to make sure we got home safely because the rain was really scary and was really coming down hard. I was so grateful once we made it back home safely. Something else that comes to mind for me when I think of storms is how one of our dogs, Belle, is really scared of them. As soon as that first crack of thunder hits, she becomes incredibly anxious, pants a lot, and sometimes even jumps on top of me in the middle of the night and wakes me up because she's so scared and she just wants to be close to me. We ended up buying her this thing called a thunder shirt, which is basically just this shirt that you kind of wrap around your dog, and it just feels like it's like a tight kind of shirt wrapped around them, and it's supposed to provide comfort, and it actually does, and it helps her a lot. Along with the thunder shirt, we are also very intentional about providing her with some extra pets and snuggles to get through it. As annoying as it can be to be woken up in the middle of the night by my dog, who I love very much, it has never crossed my mind to do anything but care for her, but give her some extra love and care during the storms. So, what about you? What comes to mind when you hear this story? Is there another story about storms in the Bible that you think of? What are some different experiences you've had with storms? Have you ever been on a boat in the middle of one? Or in your car like me? What if you were in this boat, in this particular storm? How would you feel? How would you act? In the previous chapter, we have Jesus teaching back-to-back parables as a way to share more about what the kingdom of heaven is like. We have the parable of the sower, the parable of the weeds among the wheat, the mustard seed, the yeast, the treasure hidden in the field, a merchant in search of pearls, and the parable of a net being thrown into the sea. After this extensive stretch of teaching, Jesus then decides to head back to his hometown, where he ends up being rejected. rejected by the people that he grew up with. That's tough. You would think that you could at least count on the support from your own community, the place that you grew up. Then chapter 14 begins with the tragic death of John the Baptist. And after hearing about what happened to his friend, Jesus wanted some space and alone time. And the text tells us he went to a deserted place by himself. But quickly, folks found out where he was and came to him. And this is the setting of the incredible story of Jesus feeding the 5,000, the story that happens right before our passage today. So these are all the events in the book of Matthew that lead up to this story, to this storm. Our passage in verse 22 begins with Jesus again needing some alone time. He sends the disciples on ahead of him, dismisses the crowd he just fed, and heads up into a mountain to pray by himself. While Jesus is resting, alone, and praying, the disciples are now in the middle of the sea, fighting for their lives in this storm. The text gives us the scene. They were being battered by waves. They were far from land, and the wind was brutal. Then, out of nowhere, in the midst of the waves and the rain, they see a figure, but they can't make it out. Is it a ghost? It's not a boat, but what else could possibly be on top of the waves like that? At this point, you may recall sermons that you've heard on this passage before. I know for me, a common way that this story is preached focuses on this moment. The disciples are terrified. Jesus reassures them. Peter asks Jesus to prove it is him by allowing him to walk on water. Jesus calls him out. Peter begins to walk, but then starts to sink. Jesus rebukes him for his lack of faith, pulls him and himself back in the boat. The storm comes to an end, and the main point is brought home. Be courageous, get out of the boat, but have stronger faith and keep your focus on Jesus. But what if this story is more than just an example of lack of faith? What if it's actually okay to lack faith? In fact, I wonder if Peter would have still started to sink even if he had kept his gaze on Jesus, because something I do know in this world is bad things still happen, even when our faith is the strongest, even when our eyes are fixed on Jesus. And also, I don't know about you, but walking on water in the middle of a storm seems like a very reasonable time to be terrified. So I will confess, I resonate with Peter's response. So keeping all these questions and thoughts in mind, I wonder if instead Jesus' question to Peter about his doubt was out of genuine concern or an opportunity for self-reflection, rather than just a stern rebuke. When I read this passage, I honestly picture Jesus' face so kind and compassionate, giving immediate attention to his friend in need, reaching out to grab him and gently asking, "Why did you doubt?" The reason why this question feels different to me than a stern rebuke is because Jesus is not afraid to rebuke people in other parts of the story, including Peter. Actually, in a couple chapters later, in chapter 16, we see an example of Peter actually being rebuked by Jesus. In this passage, Jesus is explaining to the disciples that soon he will have to undergo great suffering and be killed, and then will rise again on the third day. In this moment, Peter takes Jesus to the side after Jesus has said these things and tries to rebuke Jesus, saying, "This must not happen." But Jesus' real rebuke comes in here when he says, "Get behind me, Satan. You are a stumbling block to me." Now that actually sounds like a real rebuke. So, if Jesus maybe wasn't rebuking Peter for his little faith and big doubts in our story at hand, and if this isn't just a story about how Peter needs to have bigger faith and less doubt, what else might we learn from this passage? Something interesting about the book of Matthew is the focus on the disciples and exploring what it means to be a disciple, what it means to follow Jesus. In fact, Matthew is the only gospel account of this story of Jesus walking on water that actually includes Peter. So clearly this interaction is very important to the author of Matthew. So what can we learn about following Jesus from this passage? And how does this all connect to our theme, this summer of love, learning to love like Jesus? Jesus clearly loves, accepts, and helps Peter in the midst of his doubts and fears, perhaps even further evidence that doubt is not a bad thing. We know this because Jesus doesn't hesitate. The text says Jesus immediately reached out his hand and caught him. Our text also conveys that Jesus simultaneously catches him and says, "You of little faith, why did you doubt?" So I wonder if Jesus' actions of catching and his question are not two separate actions, but both one of care and love for this disciple. I wonder if Jesus' question is actually a recognition that there are reasons to have fear and doubts in life, and as a way to create space to have a conversation with Peter about that. Or perhaps even more generally, we could even think about Jesus looking at Peter and saying, "Why do you doubt?" Not in a way where he's yelling at Peter and telling him, "Stop doubting," but a gentle, "Why do you doubt?" A way to create this space. Why do we doubt, congregation? Is doubt a part of what it means to be followers of Jesus? Something really interesting about this passage that I actually just learned in my preparation is that this particular word for doubt actually only shows up in its original language, the Greek, a total of 2 times in the entire book of Matthew. Here in this passage and in Matthew 28, the famous Great Commission passage, which is actually a total coincidence, but when I preached at Second Calvary last month, I actually preached on Matthew 28. And the Great Commission, which is the story of the Great Commission, without having any idea that there was this connection in the language between these 2 passages. In preparation for this story, I literally did what Pastor Melissa told me to do: think of a favorite story of Jesus and explore what it means to love like Jesus. So discovering this connection was really amazing and really cool. So I can't help but wonder if there's maybe something important I'm supposed to learn about doubt and how that's connected to following Jesus and Jesus' love for us. So in this passage, Jesus has been raised from the dead, the Matthew 28 passage, just as a quick summary. Jesus has just been raised from the dead, and the message has been passed along to the disciples. They're told by Mary Magdalene and the other Mary to go and meet Jesus. And then in this passage where this word shows up, the English translation reads, "And when they saw him, they worshiped him, but some doubted." So some of y'all already know what I'm about to say here, but again, just as a reminder, or for those who didn't hear me preach last month, another way to translate this passage in Greek is actually to say that that the disciples doubted and worshiped when they saw Jesus. So this is what I kind of argue as maybe a possibility, that it's just as likely that we could imagine just one group of disciples, both worshiping and doubting as a reaction to seeing the risen Jesus, rather than the way our English text conveys it as kind of these 2 separate incidents. And this idea actually connects really well with our passage today, because as we look a little closer at what's going on with Peter as he tries to walk on water, we read that he noticed the strong wind and became frightened and began to sink. But he also cried out, "Lord, save me." It looks to me like Peter was simultaneously doubting and also putting his faith in Jesus to help him in that moment. So what is it that I'm supposed to learn, that we're supposed to learn about doubt today? And how does it connect to following and loving Jesus? I can't help but wonder, is something new that we can learn from this passage today through this lens of learning to love like Jesus is learning to meet people in that place of doubt. Through Jesus' simultaneous action of saving Peter and his words, "Why do you doubt?" I wonder if we too can learn that our love and care for others happens in the midst of moments of doubt and fear and uncertainty. What if from this passage, to love like Jesus, we are supposed to just grab someone's hand and make space for them, make space for their fears, make space for their questions? But what about our own doubts? It's one thing to accept and make space for others, but what about ourselves? Is there space here at HPC for us to seriously reflect on that question, the question of doubts, without worrying about being rebuked? Are we able to meet each other here in that space of vulnerability without judgment? Are we, like Jesus, able to hold someone's hand and simply meet them in their place of doubt? Or like Peter, are we able to learn how to exercise and express our little faith in the midst of fears and doubts? I truly hope and pray that this is and continues to be a community where we can. What I have learned from this passage and this theme of doubt is that loving like Jesus sometimes looks like simply reaching out a hand and making space for people's pain. This kind of love is important because it is a kind of love that is often overlooked or minimized. Just like with the passage, it is so easy to focus on the dramatic tale of the storm and walking on water and pointing out Peter's faults, all the while missing this moment of love, this moment of reaching out and catching a friend's hand and pulling him in the boat. Peter was deserving of that love, that help, that care, not because he had it all together, not because he had the biggest faith, not because he successfully walked on water, but just because he, like the rest of us, are human and therefore deserving of love. After all, that is what unconditional love is, a love that is not based on any specific condition. What is also amazing about this kind of love is that we don't need a lot of money or resources. We don't need to be the smartest or have all the answers. We don't have to be the best Christians. All we have to do is reach out and be present. In closing, I also need to say that loving like Jesus also looks like loving ourselves and believing that just as important as it is for us to love on others in this way, we are deserving of that kind of love from others and from ourselves. I think it's a big deal that this topic of self-love has come up in almost every sermon in this series. The reminder that we are only really able to best love others when we love ourselves. This is something we also learn from Jesus himself in this very passage. This whole passage starts out with Jesus sending his disciples away, dismissing the crowd so that he can have some alone time in the mountain to pray. Jesus, fully God and fully human, recognized his need for some time alone, time to reflect and rest. Again, as a reminder, he had just been doing a ton of preaching. He was rejected by his hometown just in the previous chapter. Then his friend John dies. He was having a hard time. He was in a lot of pain, probably. And instead of just pushing through and joining the disciples on the boat, he knew that he needed time alone. Congregation, this is true for us too. If Jesus needs rest, we do too. And it's something we need to take seriously. And I don't just mean taking vacations or watching TV, as great as those can be in a busy week. I mean a step beyond self-care to intentional self-reflection, healing, and rest. This may look like deciding to finally go to therapy, or actually getting those 8 hours of sleep a night, joining a support group, and making sure that you have a community that loves and supports you, a community you trust, and where you can be your authentic self. This means intentionally learning and growing as an individual. It looks different for all of us, but is equally important. So friends, what does it mean to love like Jesus? As we have been reminded many times this summer already, it means taking care of ourselves, like Jesus did. It means loving ourselves like Jesus loved himself. He would not have told us so many times to love our neighbor as ourselves if that wasn't something he believed or he himself practiced in order to love others better. And secondly, loving like Jesus means reaching out a hand and meeting others in that place of doubt. Friends, as we leave this place today, I encourage you to love like Jesus. Whether that be taking the first step toward your own growth and healing or reaching out a hand to a friend in need, we are called to love. So let's put that love in action together today. Let's pray. God of love, thank you for meeting us in our places of doubt and worry and fear. Thank you for your love, a love that is not based on the size of our faith or our ability to walk on water. Help us as we go into this week to seek out intentional ways to put this love that we learned from you, both love for others and love for self, in action. Amen.